The letter had painted such a picture that Lorena Whitlow had folded it beneath her pillow on the long train ride, West fingering the paper until the creases grew soft and blurred. A sturdy home nestled by a ridge, a man with strong hands and gentle ways, food enough to fill more than one empty stomach, even a flock of chickens clucking out fresh eggs each dawn. It had sounded like a dream sent by Providence, and Lorena, alone in the world after too many years of serving others, had dared to believe it. But when the train screeched to its halt at Ash Hollow Station, no man waited. Only the hiss of steam, the grit of dust, and a horizon so wide it threatened to swallow her whole. She stepped down, boots crunching against the platform, two trunks tugging at her arms, and her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Miss Whitlow. The voice was high and young, not what she had expected. She turned. A boy stood barefoot in the dirt, no more than 10 years old, hair sun-bleached to straw eyes squinting against the glare. He looked at her as though he half doubted she was real. "Yes," Lorena said, throat dry. The boy nodded once. Pause dead. The words cracked the air, sharper than the train whistle. Lorena blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Silas. My pa. Died 2 days ago. Snake bite. We buried him ourselves." The station faded around her, the dust, the whistle, the rattle of departing wheels. All she heard was the hollow sound of a promise collapsing. Her grip tightened on her satchel. "There must be a mistake," she whispered. "I was to marry him. He sent for me." "He knew you were coming," the boy said. His voice carried no malice, only the weight of truth too heavy for a child. "That's why he wrote. Wrote it after he got bit. Said maybe you'd still come anyway." Her eyes stung, though, whether from the grit in the wind or the sharpness of despair she couldn't say. "What's your name?" "Ezra Talmadge." He straightened a little, as if the syllables alone were armor. "And how many of you are there?" "7. He paused, then added with painful honesty. 6 now that we lost Jenny last winter." His gaze flicked toward the tracks, as if expecting her to turn and catch the departing train. "We don't got anyone else. The baby's still nursing." Behind Lorena, the iron wheels groaned, and the train began to lurch forward, carrying away the only road back east. She looked at her trunks, at her aching hands, then at Ezra, thin-shouldered, barefoot, standing solid, as if braced against every storm the prairie could conjure. "Where's the house?" she asked at last. Ezra lifted one trunk with surprising practice. "Beyond Coyote Bluff. It's small. So am I," she murmured. He didn't smile. He simply set off down the path, and she followed her steps unsure, but carried forward by something stronger than reason. The road wound past parched grass and a lonely cottonwood tree bent from wind. The silence of the plains pressed close, broken only by the shuffle of Ezra's feet and the far call of a hawk. Lorena's throat tightened. She had come expecting a husband. Instead, she trailed a boy toward a ghost's dwelling. When they crested the rise, she saw it a squat cabin leaning under its own weight porch boards, sagging a chimney blackened and cracked. It looked less like a home than a secret clinging to the land. Inside, the air smelled of ashes and beans boiled too thin of cloth, long unwashed. 6 faces lifted at her entrance, wide eyes staring in silence. A baby slept in a wooden crate by the fire, wrapped in a quilt patched so many times it resembled a map of heartbreak. Ezra dropped her trunk with a thud and gestured toward the empty chair at the head of the table. "That was Pa's," he said. Lorena's hand hovered at the chair back, then fell away. "Then it stays empty." A girl of perhaps 8 stood slowly, dark braids streaked with dust, wooden spoon gripped as though it were a weapon. "I'm Mercy," she said evenly. "I stir things. Mama used to before she bled out after Jonah." Her words struck like a bell, too calm, too old for such a small frame. Lorena glanced into the pot on the hearth, thin broth with 2 beans floating, a potato whittled into 7 slices. Hunger clung to the room like a second skin. Without speaking, Lorena set down her satchel, rolled up her sleeves, and drew from her own trunk the salted pork she had hidden from the conductor, along with a pouch of dried herbs. She dropped the meat into the pot, crushed the leaves between her fingers, and let the new scent bloom through the cabin. The children leaned forward as if the air itself fed them. Even the baby stirred. Lorena worked quickly, ladling into mismatched bowls, pressing them into small hands. "Eat slowly," she instructed. "Let your bellies remember." They obeyed in silence, chewing carefully, glancing at her as though she were a strange bird alighted on their doorstep. Mercy blinked fast, trying to hide tears. Lorena didn't sit. Her stomach ached, but she let it. One meal wasn't for her. It was for staking a claim not to land, but to their survival. When the bowls were licked clean, the children filed outside to wash in a tin pail. Lorena stepped onto the porch, the sky overhead stretching wider than any church roof stars already pricking through the indigo. She folded her arms against the chill. Behind her, Ezra lingered at the table, shoulders squared like a man twice his age. In the hush of that prairie night, Lorena felt the weight of what had been set before her. She had not come for love nor for fortune. But standing there with a house full of half-fed children, she sensed a whisper deep in her chest. "Perhaps you came for something greater, Ezra," she said quietly when he joined her at last. "I don't know how, but I'm not leaving." He didn't answer at first, only swung his legs against the porch rail, eyes on the endless sky. Then barely more than a breath. Good. The word carried more trust than any vow. And in that fragile moment, Lorena Whitlow, who had arrived a stranger, began the long, unseen work of becoming theirs. Morning came sharp and pale, the kind of dawn that cut straight through quilts and into bone. Lorena rose before the children stirred, pressing her hands against her skirt to still the tremor there. The cabin smelled faintly of last night's stew, though little remained. The fire had died, low embers glowing like tired eyes, and outside the wind rattled the porch boards. Ezra came in from the yard, cheeks red from cold arms, hugging a small bundle of wood. He set it by the hearth without a word, then gave Lorena a long look, one that asked a question he was too proud to speak. "Will you stay today too?" she answered with action. She knelt by the fire and coaxed it back to life, feeding the flames patiently until warmth licked at the air again. The baby in the crate squirmed, fussing. Mercy moved to hush him, but Lorena stepped closer, lifting the small body into her arms. The child was lighter than a loaf of bread, his skin warm but too thin. She rocked him, humming a hymn half forgotten from childhood, and the cabin seemed to exhale. When the others woke, they shuffled to the table where empty bowls waited. Lorena placed her palms on the rough wood. "We'll need more than scraps if we're to make it through," she said. "What do you usually eat?" "Cornmeal," Ezra replied. "Sometimes beans if Pa traded right." Mercy added, "Jonah caught a rabbit once, but not often." Her small shoulders lifted in a helpless shrug. Lorena thought of her trunks, the meager stores tucked inside flour lard, wrapped in paper, a small tin of dried apples she'd saved from Kansas. Not much, but it would buy them a few mornings. She rose, fetched the flour, and set about mixing biscuits in the cracked bowl. Little hands gathered around to watch, eyes wide as though she were performing a miracle. "You'll each take a turn," she said, firmly guiding Ezra's hand as he stirred, then Mercy's, then the younger boy's. By the time the dough was patted into the iron pan and set over the fire, the children were giggling at the flour, dusting their noses. For the first time since her arrival, laughter echoed in the small cabin. When the biscuits browned and filled the room with a rich smell, Lorena divided them carefully. She took none for herself, but Ezra noticed and shoved half of his portion across the table. "You need strength, same as us," he said, stubborn as a mule. Her throat tightened. She accepted, breaking off a small bite and chewing slowly, savoring not just the food, but the boy's quiet defiance. Later that morning, Lorena stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. Beyond the ridge, smoke rose in a thin gray ribbon. It didn't twist like chimney smoke. It was darker, heavier, curling from the east where no homestead stood. Her stomach knotted. Ezra followed her gaze. His jaw tightened. "That's not ours," he muttered. "Does anyone pass through here?" she asked. "Hardly ever." "Then someone's watching." They exchanged a glance, silent understanding passing between them. Lorena drew her shawl tighter. Fear pricked at her, but it mingled with resolve. These children had already lost too much. She would not let shadows steal what little they had left. That evening she made the stew stretch further than it should have, letting the pot simmer until the broth thickened. She told Mercy to keep the baby close. The younger ones sensed the tension, their voices dropping to whispers. Ezra stayed near the doorway, shoulders squared as though ready to defend the house with nothing more than his thin frame. After the children fell asleep, Lorena lingered on the porch, candlelight flickering behind her. The plains lay silent, but for the mournful cry of a coyote. Ezra padded out beside her. "You thinking what I am?" he asked. "That someone's come for something," she replied. "Maybe for me, or maybe for the land." Ezra scowled, his small fists clenched. "You'd leave. If it meant keeping us safe, I'd fight first." He gave her a sideways glance. "You don't look like a fighter. That's what makes it work," she said, her voice steady. Across the ridge, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A rider tall and still his figure, a dark cutout against the sky. He did not approach, only watched. Then he vanished into the smoke. Lorena's pulse pounded in her ears. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the small table by candlelight and unfolded a scrap of paper. Her pen scratched steady lines, though her hands shook. "If I fall, let them say I came empty-handed and still made a home." She left the note unaddressed, meant for no one but the wind. By dawn, the smoke was gone. Yet when Lorena stepped into the yard, she found the henhouse door hanging askew, 2 hens missing the woodpile trampled with boot marks. A warning plain as scripture. She gathered the children close that morning, set them to peeling potatoes and telling stories to keep their minds light. But inside her apron pocket she carried the broken latch she'd found dangling from the barn. Her fingers brushed it again and again, reminding herself she had not come for love, but she had found a calling fiercer than any vow. She would not abandon them. Not to hunger, not to grief, not to men lurking on ridges. Lorena Whitlow had come west a bride, but by that second dawn she understood the truth: she was being forged into a mother. The third morning in Ash Hollow broke with a pale wash of sunlight across the bluff. A weak warmth that failed to chase away the chill in Lorena Whitlow's bones. She had slept, little ears tuned to every creak of timber, every cry from the baby, every whisper of wind against the shutters. The rider's shadow still lingered in her mind, like smoke that refused to clear. Inside the cabin, the children stirred one by one. Ezra rose first, slipping out quietly to fetch water. Mercy tied back her braids with a scrap of cloth and began fussing with the pot as if she were twice her age. The younger boys stumbled about, their laughter quick to come, though always cautious, as if joy might be stolen away the moment they trusted it. Lorena looked at them and felt a hollow ache. They deserved more than scraps of hope, she thought. She straightened her back. If the Lord had handed her this burden, she would carry it with both hands. She set the children to tasks, sweeping the dirt floor, stacking the chopped wood, washing what bowls they had. Ezra returned with a bucket sloshing full, his arms trembling from the weight. Lorena smiled faintly, relieved to see him proud of his strength. "Ezra," she said, "would you show me the land? I need to know what we have." He led her out past the leaning fence beyond the slope where dry grass bent in the wind. "We used to have a garden," he said, pointing at a patch of hard earth. "Mama tried planting beans, but the soil went sour." Lorena knelt, running her fingers through the dirt. It crumbled dry and lifeless, but she spotted hints of darker soil deeper down. "It can be coaxed back," she murmured. "The land isn't dead, just waiting." Ezra looked doubtful but didn't argue. They continued toward the barn, its roof sagging, boards splitting. The smell of old straw and something sour lingered inside. One corner had collapsed entirely. The trough was bone dry and the ground was scuffed with prints, boot marks mixed with chicken tracks. "They came close," Ezra muttered. His jaw tightened. Lorena crouched, tracing the boot print with her finger. The heel was worn down, the shape narrow. Not a rancher's boot, she thought, too fine for honest work. Whoever had come wasn't hunting food. They were testing boundaries. She stood, brushing dirt from her palms. "We'll fix the latch. Tonight we bar the doors tighter. Whoever's watching, they need to know we won't be easy prey." Ezra's mouth pressed into a hard line. "You sound like Pa." The words stung and soothed all at once. Lorena swallowed. "Maybe that's what you need." By midday, she had gathered the children inside for a meal of boiled potatoes and biscuits. She tried to lighten the mood with stories, tales of riverboats on the Mississippi, of bustling markets and street, Louis, of fireflies glittering like fallen stars. The little ones leaned close, wide-eyed, their imaginations lifting them beyond the rough cabin walls. Even Mercy smiled faintly, though she stirred the pot, as if afraid to stop. When they'd eaten, Lorena slipped away to the hearth where she'd noticed a loose floorboard. She pried it up carefully, half expecting to find nothing but dust. Instead, her fingers brushed fabric, an old strip of lace tied around a bundle. Heart-hammering, she lifted it out. A ledger, worn and thin. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside were entries scrawled in a man's hand, births and deaths, harvest tallies, even a crude sketch of a chicken coop that had never been built. The ink blurred in places as if written in haste. On the last page, one sentence leapt out. "Lorena Whitlow arrives June 3. She is to be treated kindly. She has nothing. but we will give her all we have." Lorena's breath caught. Her throat burned. Silas Talmadge, a man she had never met, had written her into his family's story, even as death hovered over him. Ezra appeared behind her, silent as a cat. He peered at the ledger, then back at her face. He knew. Ezra said softly, "Pa told me. She'll come. Wait for her no matter what." Tears blurred her sight. She closed the book, pressing it to her chest. "Your father had faith in me before I ever set foot here." Ezra shifted, uneasy with her emotion. "You don't have to stay just because he hoped." Lorena looked around the patched quilt, the worn boots by the door, the small pile of mismatched shoes. Her gaze landed on the baby asleep in the crate, lips twitching as if dreaming of milk. "It's not hope keeping me here," she whispered. "It's choice." That night, Lorena did not sleep much. She sat by the table with a candle burning, low, pen in hand. She began her own ledger entry in careful script. "Today I claim these children as mine. Not by law, not by blood, by vow." When the candle guttered out, she closed the book and placed it back beneath the floorboard. Then she checked the door twice, slid the bar firm into place, and curled on the floor near the baby's crate shawl around her shoulders. Outside, the wind whistled across Coyote Bluff. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled back. Yet inside that fragile cabin, Lorena knew something had begun. Not a marriage, not the life she'd imagined, but a home stitched from scraps, warmed by fragile hope, and bound by a promise stronger than any ring. The days that followed blurred into one another, stitched together by chores, hunger, and the fragile rhythm of survival. Lorena Whitlow rose with the pale sun each morning, shaking off weariness that clung to her bones, and found herself learning the shape of this family she had not chosen but now claimed. Ezra shouldered burdens far too heavy for his 10 years, fetching wood, checking the barn, trying to stand like a man who could shield the others. Mercy moved quietly, carrying her mother's absence like a shadow, her little hands always in the pot or on the baby's back. The younger boys, Thomas, Levi, and Jonas, drifted between mischief and melancholy, their laughter quick but brittle, ready to shatter at the faintest crack of fear. Lorena gave them tasks, not because the work alone mattered, but because every potato peeled, every broom pushed, every stick of kindling stacked, was proof they were not drifting apart. She told them often, idle hands invite sorrow, busy hands build hope. Still, each evening her eyes slid toward the east ridge. Though the smoke had vanished, she never shook the image of that silent rider. Whoever he was, he had left boot prints and unease behind. On the 4th night after the children slept, Lorena sat alone on the porch. The stars blazed sharp and cold. She held the ledger she had found, tracing the lines Silas Talmadge had written, with hands already stiffening toward death. Her chest tightened with something she had not expected: grief for a man she had never met. Grief and a strange, stubborn gratitude. The porch creaked. Ezra stepped out, carrying a chipped mug of water. "You're reading Pa's book again," he said, almost accusing. "It's not just his," Lorena replied softly. "It belongs to all of you. And now, to me." Ezra scuffed his heel against the board, his thin shoulders taut. "Pa told me not to trust strangers, but he wrote your name in there like you were already family." Lorena closed the ledger and looked at him. "I can't replace what you lost, Ezra. But I won't leave you. That much I promise." His mouth pressed into a thin line, but his eyes shimmered in the starlight. He turned his face away before she could see the tears threatening to fall. The next day dawned hard and gray, the air heavy with a coming storm. Lorena pushed herself into motion, determined to repair what she could. She gathered the children, armed them with buckets and rags, and set about patching the cabin roof with tar cloth scavenged from the barn. It was clumsy work, but laughter bubbled as the younger boys smeared themselves with pitch. For a few blessed hours, the cabin echoed with something other than grief. By evening, the storm broke rain, hammering the patched roof, thunder growling across the plains. Inside, Lorena kept the stew pot simmering, coaxing warmth into weary bodies. They sat close, bowls in hand, listening to the wind scream against the shutters. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, almost lost in the storm. Lorena froze, ladle in hand. The children went still, eyes wide. Another knock followed, firmer, insistent. Ezra's jaw set. He reached for the rusted rifle hanging above the mantel, though Lorena knew it held no bullets. She touched his arm. "Stay here," she whispered. Heart pounding, she moved to the door. The wooden bar creaked as she lifted it, rain dripping through the cracks. Slowly she pulled the door open. A man stood there, rain streaming down his hat-brim coat, heavy with mud. He held no weapon in sight, only a small satchel slung over his shoulder. His face was lean, weather-worn, and shadowed with something that looked more like regret than menace. "I'm looking for Silas Talmadge," he said, his voice rough as gravel. Lorena's chest tightened. "He's gone. Snakebite. Buried 2 weeks past." The stranger lowered his head, removing his hat. Rain plastered his dark hair against his brow. "That's what I feared." His eyes lifted again, piercing hers. "I'm Gideon Talmadge, his brother." Behind Lorena, Ezra let out a sharp breath. "Pa never said he had a brother." "That sounds like him," Gideon muttered bitterly. "We didn't part on kind terms." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a bundle bound in cloth. "I came because of this." Lorena hesitated, then accepted it. Another ledger. She untied the cloth with trembling fingers and opened the book. Unlike Silas's thin, half-filled volume, this one brimmed with entries, letters, exchanged notes of harvests, sketches of fences, lists of debts paid and debts still owed. At the very back, in Silas's unmistakable hand, a line leapt out. "If I die before she arrives, let her keep the house. Let her raise them if she chooses. And if she does not, bury this letter with me and forgive me for hoping." Lorena's breath hitched. She closed the ledger, clutching it to her chest. "He asked me to choose," she whispered. Gideon's gaze softened. "And what will you choose?" The children huddled behind her, 6 pairs of eyes filled with fear and desperate hope. Ezra's small hands gripped the rifle stock tight. Mercy clutched the baby closer, as if shielding him from fate itself. Lorena straightened her shoulders. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady as the storm outside. "This is my home now." For the first time since she had stepped off the train, she felt the words anchor deep in her soul. The cabin was fragile, the future uncertain, but her vow was unshakable. She was no longer merely a bride waiting for a husband who would never come. She was a mother, and this was her family. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the earth soggy and the sky raw with streaks of silver. The air smelled of wet soil and smoke. Lorena Whitlow stepped outside the cabin shawl, pulled tight her eyes, scanning the ridge. The night's visitor, Gideon Talmadge, had slept near the barn, refusing the offer of a blanket inside. He rose now, brushing rain from his coat, his figure tall and gaunt, like a man whittled down by miles and mistakes. She approached cautiously. "You should come in for breakfast. There's hot water at least." Gideon shook his head. "I'm not here to linger, only to see his children, and to make sure his words were kept." Lorena searched his face. There was something in his expression, a hardness born from long roads, but also a tenderness buried beneath a tenderness he fought to hide. "They're frightened," she said quietly. "They've lost too much already. They'll lose more if you're not careful." He muttered, gaze drifting toward the distant ridge. "There are men out there who smell weakness. Silas owed debts, favors not repaid. They'll come knocking." Lorena's stomach tightened, but she refused to show fear. "Then let them knock," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "This house will not fall easily." Gideon studied her for a long moment, then pulled something from his satchel. A small iron key. He pressed it into her palm. "Under the floorboards. There's a safe. Silas meant it for you." Her breath caught. "What's inside?" "Not what you're hoping for," Gideon said. "No gold, no treasure. Just the last of him." His eyes flicked toward the cabin where children's voices stirred faintly. "Guard it well." He turned as if to leave, but Ezra appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, chin lifted in a way that mirrored his father's stubbornness. "You can't just go," the boy said. "You're blood." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Blood don't always bind, boy. Choices do." His gaze slid to Lorena. "Seems she's chosen more than I ever did." Lorena opened her mouth to protest, but the man swung onto his chestnut horse hat, low against the morning light. "Keep them safe," he said. Then he was gone, a blur against the open prairie, leaving only the echo of hooves and the weight of the key in her palm. That night, after the children had eaten their thin supper and drifted into uneasy sleep, Lorena knelt by the hearth. Her hands trembled as she pried up the loose board Gideon had spoken of. Beneath lay a narrow safe, rusted at the hinges, hidden in the earth like a buried secret. She slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside were papers folded carefully, a deed to the land unsigned but bearing Silas's name. A letter addressed simply, to the woman who says yes even after she knows. And a small pouch tied with string. Lorena unfolded the letter first, her eyes moving slowly over the words written in a hand that had faltered near its end. If you are reading this, I am gone. You came anyway. That makes you braver than I ever was. I did not send for you out of loneliness, but because I knew I was leaving, and I could not bear for them to grow up without knowing what it means to be held. If you turn back, I will not blame you. But if you stay, everything here is yours, the land, the name, and if they let you, the children. Not because I chose you, but because I trusted you would choose them. Her tears fell freely onto the page. She pressed the letter to her chest, whispering into the quiet cabin. I choose them. I do. She opened the pouch next. 7 buttons each, different bone, wood, metal, glass, even one carved from shell. They were worn smooth keepsakes from baby clothes, long since outgrown. She ran her fingers over each one, realizing Silas had kept them all tiny tokens of lives he'd helped bring into the world. When she returned the pouch to the safe, her hands shook with something fiercer than grief. It was resolve solid as stone. She had been written into their story not by accident, but by a man who had believed in her before she ever set foot on this soil. Later on the porch, Ezra joined her. His eyes were shadowed, wary but curious. What did you find? Proof, Lorena said softly. Proof your father wanted me here. Ezra looked down, his toes curling against the worn boards. You could still leave. You ain't tied. Lorena shook her head. I am tied. Not by rope, not by law, but by the promise I made when I put food in your bowls. I will not walk away. The boy's throat worked as though swallowing stones. Slowly he leaned against her side, stiff at first, then softening. It was the smallest gesture, yet it cracked something open inside her. The wind brushed past them, carrying the smell of rain, wet sage. In that fragile moment, Lorena knew she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer a stranger clutching trunks on a station platform. She was becoming the root of something fragile yet fierce, a home that would not be easily torn from the earth. And though shadows still lingered on the ridge, though debts and danger pressed close, Lorena Whitlow whispered into the night, You will not scatter. Not while I have breath. The prairie gave little rest. Days spun into one another, and Lorena Whitlow found herself rising before dawn and collapsing long after nightfall, carrying a weight that grew heavier yet strangely dearer with every passing hour. The children were beginning to look to her as if she had always been there. Mercy fetched her apron without being asked. The younger boys clung to her skirts whenever the wind howled, and Ezra, still cautious, still bristling with pride, watched her with a kind of wary respect. But the memory of the rider on the ridge gnawed at her. She had not forgotten the boot prints trampled into the dirt or the missing hens. Someone had come close enough to taste their warmth. And Gideon's words echoed in her mind. Silas owed debts. They'll come knocking. One morning, as frost clung to the windows, Lorena took stock of what little food remained. A handful of beans, a sack of cornmeal, nearly empty the last strip of salt pork. Her heart sank. 7 mouths to feed, and winter pressing its weight upon them. She gathered the children around the table. We'll stretch what we have, she said firmly. It will not be easy, but we'll not go hungry if we work together. Ezra frowned. We can trap rabbits. I've done it before. Lorena touched his arm. Yes, but we'll also mend the garden come spring. Every hand will help. She looked at Mercy, who straightened under her gaze. You'll keep the fire alive. That's no small duty. Fire keeps a family whole. The girl nodded solemnly, pride flickering in her eyes. That night, when the younger ones had drifted to sleep, Lorena sat at the table by lamplight. She reached for the ledger Gideon had brought, her fingers tracing the uneven scrawl of Silas's last words. The letter in the safe had told her to choose. But the ledger felt like something more. A covenant, written in ink and grief. She added her own line beneath the last entry, steadying her hand. Lorena Whitlow, November 14, I vow to remain. This house will not fall while I draw breath. She closed the book and slid it back beneath the cloth. The wind rattled the shutters, and she nearly missed the sound at first, a faint creak at the barn. She froze, heart pounding. Quietly she rose, lifted the iron poker from beside the hearth, and slipped onto the porch. The night lay still, moonlight washing the yard in silver. But there, at the edge of the barn movement, a figure tall cloaked his face, hidden by the brim of his hat. He stood motionless, watching. "Who's there?" Lorena called, her voice stronger than she felt. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he swung easily into the saddle of a waiting horse. The animal stamped once, then carried him into the dark hooves, drumming against the earth. Ezra appeared beside her, breathless, clutching the empty rifle. It was him again, wasn't it? Lorena's grip on the poker tightened. Yes, and he's not finished. The next morning, they found the barn door splintered, the latch torn free. 2 hens were gone, feathers scattered across the yard. It wasn't hunger driving whoever stalked them, it was a message. Lorena gathered the children close, her face set. "Listen to me. There are men who think a woman cannot build anything without their permission. They want us afraid. But we will not give them that power." The younger boys nodded solemnly, though fear lingered in their eyes. Ezra's jaw hardened. "We'll fight if we have to." Lorena rested a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fight, yes, but not with fear. With love that holds fast, with hands that refuse to let go." That evening she sat by the hearthpen, scratching across paper once more. This time the words weren't meant for ledgers or records. They were meant for the wind, for whatever eyes might be watching from the ridge. "If I fall, let it be said I came empty-handed and still made a home. Let it be known these children are not orphans, but mine, chosen and kept." When she finished, she folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the ledger with Silas's entries. Her vow was no longer only to the children. It was to the land itself, to the ghosts who lingered in every timber of the cabin, and to the man who had trusted her before she ever arrived. As the children slept that night, the fire flickering low, Lorena sat awake on the porch. The poker still leaned against the door, ready. The stars burned cold and sharp above her. Somewhere a rider might be watching, waiting. But she whispered into the vast night, "You will not scatter them, not while I am here." And for the first time since stepping off the train, the prairie itself seemed to listen. The prairie dawned gray and brittle, the kind of morning that set every sound on edge. Frost clung to the window panes, and the air inside the cabin smelled of damp ash and yesterday's stew. Lorena Whitlow stirred from her thin mattress, feeling the ache in her shoulders from too many nights curled on the floorboards near the baby's crate. Ezra was already awake, feeding scraps of biscuit to the small flock of hens that remained. His motions were sharp, impatient, as though daring the world to try and take more from them. Lorena watched through the crooked doorway, her chest tightening. He was 10, but his eyes had aged decades, in only weeks. She busied herself with the fire, coaxing it back to life, while Mercy hovered beside her, clutching the baby close. "Will the bad men come back?" the girl whispered, her voice thin as a reed. Lorena swallowed. "If they do, they'll find us ready." She touched Mercy's cheek. "Fear has no place in a home, child. We'll guard each other." Later that day, Lorena decided she could no longer keep the secret of the safe. If the children were to trust her fully, they had to know what she carried in her apron pocket. After supper, she gathered them around the hearth, the firelight throwing shadows across their faces. From beneath her skirt, she drew the iron key. Ezra's eyes sharpened instantly. "What's that?" "Your father's last gift," Lorena answered. She moved to the hearth, pried up the loose board, and revealed the narrow iron box hidden below. The children leaned in, holding their breath as she turned the key. The lock clicked open with a sound like finality. Inside lay the bundle of papers, the letter, and the pouch of buttons. Lorena lifted them carefully, placing each on the table as if she were laying out a holy relic. Ezra reached for the pouch, first spilling the buttons into his palm. These were ours," he whispered. His thumb traced the carved bone, one rough with age. "I remember it on Jonah's baby shirt." Mercy picked up the shell button, tears brimming. "Mama stitched this one. I thought it was lost." Lorena let them hold the treasures, watching as recognition softened their faces. "Your father kept them all," she said quietly. "He wanted you to know that even when things were taken, he held on to what mattered." Ezra looked at her then, something shifting behind his wary eyes. "And the papers." She unfolded the letter and read aloud, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Each word from Silas carried weight. His confession of knowing death was near his plea that she choose the children, his trust in her courage. When she finished, silence filled the room, broken only by the baby's soft breathing. Jonas, the youngest, after the baby, leaned against her arm. "You'll stay?" he asked simply. Lorena bent, pressing her lips to his hair. "Yes, darling. I'll stay." That night, while the children slept, with the buttons lined neatly on the mantel, Lorena sat on the porch with Ezra. The moon glowed pale, washing the land in silver. He clutched the rusted rifle across his lap, though it held no bullets. "You really mean it?" he asked, without looking at her. "You'll raise us?" Lorena's heart ached at the boy's need to hear it again. She touched his shoulder. "Not raise. Love. There's a difference." He was silent for a long time. Then with a voice rough as gravel he whispered, "Mama used to sing. The house feels empty without it." Lorena swallowed hard. Her own mother's voice flickered through her memory, soft and lilting, long gone but never erased. She began to hum, then sing an old hymn carried from her childhood. The sound wove through the night air, rising above the prairie like a fragile shield. Ezra closed his eyes, leaning back against the post, and for the first time since she had arrived, his face softened into something almost childlike. But peace was short-lived. At dawn, Lorena rose early to fetch water. As she stepped into the yard, her boot struck something hard in the mud. She bent and lifted it. A small piece of wood, splintered, carved crudely with a mark, 2 crossed lines burned deep. It was no child's whittling. It was a warning. She clenched it in her fist, her breath catching. Whoever lurked beyond the ridge wanted them to know they were not safe. Lorena turned back to the cabin fire, already lit inside, the children's voices beginning to rise. She tucked the wood into her pocket beside the iron key. Her jaw set. So be it, she thought. Let them come. They'll find a woman who will not break. The days grew shorter shadows, stretching longer over Ash Hollow. Each morning, Lorena Whitlow stepped into the chill, with her shawl wrapped tight, scanning the ridge for signs of smoke. Each night she bolted the cabin door with hands that trembled less than before, her resolve hardening like iron tempered by fire. But winter was pressing close, and sickness crept in with the cold. It began with little Jonah, his cheeks flushed, and his small hands clutching at Lorena's skirt. By breakfast, he could hardly hold his spoon, his head lolling against her arm. By midday, Mercy was pale and quiet, the spark gone from her eyes. Soon the younger boys coughed in chorus, their bodies hot and weak. Lorena's chest clenched with dread. She had seen fever before, back in Missouri, when it carried children away as swiftly as a hawk seizing a rabbit. She would not let that shadow steal these children too. She stoked the fire until her palms blistered, boiled water in battered kettles, steeped bitter tea from pine needles she had gathered near the bluff. She stripped linens into rags, laying cool cloths against burning foreheads. Her voice grew hoarse from singing lullabies she had not thought of in years. But the worst moment came when the baby ceased crying altogether. The silence was sharper than any scream. Lorena pressed the tiny body against her chest, rocking, whispering, "Stay with me, little one. Breathe with me. You are not leaving." Her tears dampened his downy hair, but she did not stop, not even when her arms went numb. 2 days of fever burned like a brand through the household. Lorena barely slept. Her eyes ringed in darkness, her back bent but unbroken. Ezra stayed near her side, refusing to rest. His young hands fetched water, chopped wood, and wrung out cloths until they were raw. But on the 3rd night, even Ezra faltered. He slumped at the hearth, watching as Mercy collapsed in the wash basin, her body limp, her lips barely moving. "Is she gone?" he asked, voice thready, shaking as though every word was a betrayal. Lorena dropped to her knees, pressing her forehead against Mercy's damp skin. "Not yet. And not today." She willed the words into truth, as if defiance itself might hold death at bay. The storm outside rattled the shutters. The fire dwindled low. Lorena's strength finally crumbled. She knelt before the hearth, hands clasped, voice cracking into the smoke. "Don't take them," she begged to the silence. "Take anything else, my breath, my life, but not them. For a heartbeat, nothing." Then the flames surged as if fed by unseen hands. Heat wrapped the room, fierce and sudden. Mercy stirred, eyes fluttering open. Jonah whimpered, asking faintly for bread. The baby shivered once, then let out the smallest cry, a sound that shattered the night with hope. Ezra sagged against the wall, tears spilling freely. "You stayed," he whispered to Lorena, his voice breaking. She turned to him, her own cheeks wet. "There was never a day I wouldn't." The fever broke slowly but surely. By dawn of the fourth day, the children were sitting up weakly, sipping broth, cheeks flushed not with sickness but returning life. Lorena moved among them with a gentleness edged in exhaustion, her hands trembling as she tucked blankets, brushed damp hair from foreheads, pressed kisses to temples. She had given all she had, and it had been enough. When the last child drifted into sleep, Lorena slumped against the wall, her shawl falling loose, her eyes closing for the first real rest in days. She was not a bride here. She was not a guest. She was the heart of the house, the force that had kept its walls standing through the fire of trial. And in that quiet, the cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, as though it too knew it had survived. But survival always carried a cost. The next evening, as Lorena swept the porch with slow strokes, a shadow fell across the yard. A rider approached Gideon, returning sooner than she expected. He dismounted without a word, his eyes taking in the sight of pale faces pressed against the window glass. "They're alive," Lorena told him, her voice hoarse raw from sleepless nights. Gideon nodded, his jaw tightening as though emotion was a dangerous indulgence. He carried a sack of salted meat and a bundle of firewood. "Figured you'd need these." Lorena met his gaze. "I needed more than supplies. And I had it." She glanced back toward the children, then at the man who had once walked away from family. "I had them. And somehow they had me." Gideon's eyes softened. For the first time since she'd met him, his voice dropped low, almost reverent. Then Silas was right. He chose well. Snow dusted Ash Hollow like sifted flour, thin at first, then deeper by the week's end until fences vanished beneath drifts and every breath clouded white. The children grew stronger. As the fever's memory faded, their cheeks flushed now with life instead of sickness. Yet the house bore the mark of those dark days, blankets torn from constant use, a water bucket cracked from too many steam tents, Lorena's hands blistered and raw. Still, there was laughter again. It began timidly, Jonas giggling when the baby tugged at his hair, Mercy smiling as she scolded him for dropping crumbs on the floor. By the third night, even Ezra allowed himself a crooked grin when Lorena burned a biscuit and pretended it was a cowboy's stone. Their laughter filled the cabin, pushing out shadows that had lurked too long. One evening, as Lorena ladled stew into bowls, Ezra cleared his throat. "There's something we should say," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the table. Mercy elbowed him sharply. "Go on." Ezra hesitated, then blurted, "Mama." The word hung in the smoky air, fragile as spun glass. Lorena froze, ladle dripping broth back into the pot. She turned slowly, searching his face. "What did you say?" Ezra's chin lifted defiant, though his eyes shone. "You're our mama now. Not by blood maybe, but by choice. And that counts more." The younger boys echoed him, voices stumbling over the word but eager. "Mama." Mercy whispered it, last her lips trembling as if tasting a forbidden sweetness. Lorena's knees went weak. She gripped the table edge, breath shuddering. Tears stung her eyes, but she let them fall, smiling through the ache in her chest. "Then I'll be that for you," she whispered. "For every day I'm given breath." Ezra's shoulders dropped, the hard edge in him softening. He leaned forward, almost shy, and for the first time laid his head against her arm. The others crowded close, wrapping her in small, thin limbs, and in that moment the little cabin on Coyote Bluff ceased to be a house of orphans. It became a home sealed by a single word spoken in unison. The following days found new rhythm. Mercy took charge of the kitchen, bossing her brothers with the authority of a general. Ezra patrolled the yard with the rusted rifle perched on his shoulder, standing guard as though the weight of the bluff depended on him. Lorena stitched quilts from flour sacks, each square rough, but stitched with care while the baby gurgled at her feet. But peace was rarely long-lived on the frontier. One frosted afternoon, as the children gathered wood, Lorena heard hoofbeats crunching over frozen ground. She stepped onto the porch, hand instinctively brushing the iron poker by the door. Two men rode up, strangers with dust-worn coats and eyes sharp as blades. The taller one sneered. Well now. Word in town was true. Bride came, but no groom to claim her. He spat into the snow. "That means these children aren't yours, ma'am. By law, they're wards of the county." The shorter man dismounted, unfolding a crumpled paper with a red seal. "Land's in debt. House has no rightful head. You got no claim here." Ezra stepped out before Lorena could stop him, rifle clutched tight, though empty of shot. "She's our family. You can't take us." The taller man laughed. Boy, the law says different. Then Mercy appeared beside her brother, barefoot in the snow, arms crossed her face set in fierce defiance. Pa's dead, Ma's buried. She stayed when she could have run. That makes her ours. Lorena's heart surged. She placed a hand on both their shoulders. You'll do no taking today, she said, her voice ringing steady as church bells. This house may not have papers carved in stone, but it was built by hands that bled for it. These children are not unclaimed, they are mine. The taller man took a step forward, but before he could speak, a low click echoed across the yard. Gideon Talmadge stood at the barn's edge, shotgun resting loose but ready across his arm. His gaze was cold, his stance unyielding. The strangers faltered, muttered curses, and tugged their reins. They rode off spitting dust and promising to return with sheriffs and more seals. Lorena's chest heaved as the children pressed close. Ezra still clutched the rifle, his knuckles white. She bent low, cupping his cheek. You stood for me. His lip trembled, but he nodded. You stood for us first. In that fragile exchange, Lorena understood what bound them together was not ink, not signatures, not the approval of courts. It was the stubborn choice to remain, to fight to love when walking away would have been easier. And in that moment she knew they were no longer a house bracing against storms. They were a family learning to build in spite of them. The snow did not relent. By December, Ash Hollow lay buried beneath drifts so deep that even the fence posts looked like broken teeth jutting from a white sea. The wind keened down from the ridge, sharp and merciless, yet inside the Talmadge cabin a strange warmth began to grow. Neighbors, long cautious, started to appear at the door. Mrs. Penhaligon, the widow from 3 miles west, arrived one evening with a sack of dried apples and a sharp tongue softened by kindness. Children need sweet, not just stew, she declared, pressing the sack into Mercy's small hands. Old Otis Clegg, the blacksmith, trudged through knee-high snow to lend his hammer for a day's mending. Even the preacher, who rarely left town, sent a bundle of books tied with twine, a note tucked on top. You've done what most of us only pray for. Lorena felt the shift in the air. Where once she had been eyed as a stranger, now the community seemed to draw near, as if her stubborn presence had built something worth circling around. Evenings became different too. Instead of silence or coughing, the cabin filled with stories. Ezra would retell a tale of Silas's younger days, embellishing until the younger boys howled with laughter. Mercy, cheeks glowing from the hearth's heat, recited verses she'd memorized. Lorena listened, sewing quilts from old flour sacks, her needle dipping in rhythm with the cadence of their voices. The baby tugged at her skirts, gurgling his approval as if laughter itself had become a new kind of nourishment. Yet Lorena never forgot the men who had ridden away with threats curling in their voices. The memory of the red seal on that crumpled paper haunted her. She knew they would return, and she would need more than defiance when they did. One bitter night the knock came again. It wasn't sharp or cruel this time, but tentative, almost timid. When Lorena opened the door, wind howled through, carrying with it a figure hunched and trembling. A girl no more than 16, barefoot and clutching a bundle to her chest. Her lips were cracked, her eyes hollow, with the same look Lorena had once worn, stepping off the train, a mix of shame and desperation. Please, the girl whispered. The bundle stirred a baby smaller even than the Talmadge infant, wheezing faintly. Lorena didn't hesitate. She pulled the girl inside, wrapped her in a patched quilt, and pressed her close to the fire. You're not late, Lorena murmured, brushing ice from the girl's tangled hair. You're right on time. The girl collapsed into her arms, sobbing, quietly relief soaking into Lorena's shoulder. Her name was Ione Harper. She had fled a house where cruelty reigned, carrying her sick child in the hopes of finding mercy somewhere on the endless plains. She had no family willing to take her, no place to go. The children accepted her without question. Mercy took the baby, holding him as though she had been waiting her whole life to comfort another. Ezra brewed tea from pine needles, his hands steady despite the cold. Jonas tugged at the quilt to cover Ione's bare feet. No one asked where she had come from. They didn't need to. Lorena saw it in the girl's hunched shoulders, in the way she flinched at sudden noises. She had seen that look in her own reflection once a lifetime ago. You're not here to be saved, Lorena told her softly that night as the children dozed around them. You're here to remember what it feels like to matter. Ione cried again, but these were different tears. Ones that cleansed rather than crushed. By morning she was helping Mercy knead bread, her laughter hesitant but real. That winter the cabin grew crowded but also fuller in ways Lorena hadn't imagined. With Ione there and her baby cooing alongside the Talmadge infant. The house felt less like a shelter for strays, and more like a fire, spreading, not burning, but warming everything it touched. The neighbors noticed. They stopped knocking altogether, simply stepping inside with gifts. Flour, bolts of wool, even a fiddle. One ranch hand claimed he had no use for. The cabin became a place where no one asked who the mother was because everyone already knew. Lorena sometimes stood at the window watching the snow pile against the porch rail, listening to the mingled laughter of children. For the first time she realized she was no longer living in a house of ghosts. She was living in a house of beginnings. But beneath that peace still lay the memory of boot prints in the mud of men with red-sealed papers of debts not yet forgiven. She knew trials would return as relentless as winter storms. And when they did, she would meet them not as a bride abandoned, nor as a stranger desperate for belonging. She would meet them as what she had become, a mother forged by choice, with a family stitched together from loss, defiance, and love strong enough to outlast the wind. Winter had settled into Ash Hollow with the heavy hand of a warden. Snow lay in thick drifts against the cabin walls, swallowing fences and burying the path down toward the station. The wind whistled through the cracks of the shutters like a ghost demanding entry, but inside Lorena Whitlow kept the hearth burning day and night. She had learned quickly that warmth was more than comfort, it was a shield, the thin line between life and death on the prairie. Ezra had grown into his chores with a quiet, stubborn strength. Each morning he shouldered the axe, splitting wood until sweat froze against his temples, determined to keep the firebox full. Mercy had taken charge of the kitchen, her small hands bossing her brothers with remarkable authority, reminding them to stir the pot or fetch water before it froze solid in the pail. Ione, still pale from the hardships that had driven her here, tended to the two babies, cradling one on each arm, humming lullabies in a voice that trembled but never faltered. Lorena looked at them and felt a deep ache of pride. This was no longer a band of children scrambling to survive. This was a family, each learning the weight of duty, each discovering strength in the face of cold and scarcity. But the shadow of danger never left her mind. The men who had ridden away weeks before had not been defeated. They had only retreated. Lorena could still see the red seal stamped on their crumpled paper, hear the sneer in Brackett's voice, feel the hunger in Millerick's eyes as they spoke of debts and law. They had promised to return, and she knew enough of men like them to believe they would. The warning came on a sharp January morning. Ezra burst through the door, his breath a white cloud, his eyes wide with urgency. "Riders," he panted. "2 of them. Coming fast." The children froze spoons halfway to their mouths. Lorena's heart thudded, but she forced calm into her voice. "Stay together. Mercy, keep the babies close." Ezra set down that rifle. "I won't," he argued, gripping the rusted gun tighter. Lorena met his gaze. "You'll stand beside me, but you will not fire unless I tell you. We face this together, Ezra, as a family." A knock shook the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Lorena lifted the wooden bar and pulled it open. There they were, Brackett and Millerick, snow clinging to their boots, frost clinging to their beards. Brackett leaned forward in the saddle, eyes narrowing. "We warned you, miss. Land's in debt, children, unclaimed. No wedding, no rights. Best hand them over before the county steps in." Lorena stepped out onto the porch shawl, pulled tight, her breath rising in the icy air. Behind her, Ezra appeared with the rifle clutched across his chest, his arms shaking but his jaw set. Mercy came too barefoot in the snow, her face fierce as she stood shoulder to shoulder with her brother. "She's our mama now," Mercy declared, her voice steady as stone. "We're not going anywhere." Brackett barked a laugh. "The law don't care about pretty speeches, girl." "Then let's speak of law," Lorena said. Her voice rang out across the yard. From her apron she drew Silas's letter, the ledger Gideon had entrusted to her, and the key that had opened the safe. She held them high, the wind snapping the edges of paper. "Here are his words, his wishes, his trust. Silas Talmadge gave me this home, and I have kept it. That is law enough." Brackett's sneer deepened. He swung a leg over his saddle boots, crunching into the snow. "That won't stand in court." A sharp click split the air. From the barn's shadow, Gideon Talmadge stepped forward, shotgun resting easy across his arm. His face was hard, his voice harder. "You heard the lady. Her word stands here." Brackett froze mid-step. Millerick shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking to the shotgun, then to the children bristling with stubborn defiance, and then more voices. "Mrs." Penhaligon appeared at the fence line, her shawl wrapped tight, her arms crossed. Old Otis Clegg trudged up with hammer in hand, his breath rising in angry clouds. A ranch hand came behind them, fiddle slung across his back like a rifle. Neighbors quiet, watchful, and now gathered like a wall around the cabin. Brackett's confidence faltered. He spat into the snow, muttering curses. "This ain't finished. We'll be back with the sheriff." "Bring him," Gideon said, calm as steel. "We'll be waiting." The two men mounted and turned their horses, kicking up snow as they rode off, their threats vanishing into the frozen wind. When the yard was quiet again, Ezra lowered the rifle, his arms trembling. Lorena touched his cheek, her voice soft but firm. "You stood tall, Ezra. You both did." Mercy leaned into Lorena's side, whispering, "We'll never let them take us." Lorena drew them close, her heart pounding with fierce love. "And I will never let you go." Inside, the fire glowed bright, the babies cooed, and the family huddled close. Neighbors lingered for tea and quiet talk, their presence as reassuring as the walls themselves. The threats had not vanished, but the cabin no longer stood alone on Coyote Bluff. Lorena sank into the patch chair, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but her spirit soared. They were no longer merely surviving storms, they were weathering them together. And that made all the difference. For the first time, she believed that the bonds forged in this tiny cabin might outlast every shadow that prowled the ridge. They were more than a gathering of strays. They were a family chosen and kept. And no paper, no sheriff, no man with a red seal could tear that truth away. The winter deepened, each storm piling fresh snow against the cabin, until the windows seemed more like portholes in a buried ship. Yet within those cramped walls, the Talmadge children thrived in ways Lorena Whitlow hadn't dared to dream. Hunger no longer dominated every hour. Neighbors brought flour-dried venison, even bolts of wool. The cabin no longer echoed with grief alone, but with the sounds of a household discovering itself. Again, laughter, quarrels, and the sweet noise of two babies competing to cry the loudest. Lorena, exhausted yet fiercely alive, often caught herself pausing by the hearth simply to marvel. The children had begun to lean on one another instead of drifting apart. Mercy scolded the boys with a mother's sternness. Ezra chopped wood without being asked, and even little Jonas tried to prove his strength by carrying armloads of kindling. Ione Harper, once hollow-eyed and frightened, now moved through the kitchen with confidence, her baby tied to her chest with a strip of quilt. It was Ione who asked the question one night as the stew simmered and the snow rattled against the shutters. "Why did you let me stay?" She whispered to Lorena, her eyes shadowed by both gratitude and doubt. Lorena set down her spoon, wiping her hands on her apron. "Because I knew that look in your eyes. I wore it once. Lost, hungry, afraid no one would see me as worth keeping." She reached over, brushing Ione's hair back from her face. "You belong here because you chose to knock, and because we chose to open the door." Ione bit her lip, tears brightening her eyes. "No one's ever said I belong before." "You do now," Lorena said simply. The days fell into rhythm. Ezra and the boys kept traps near the creek Mercy, and Ione learned to stretch flour into bread that lasted longer than it had any right to. And Lorena stitched quilts until her fingers bled. Neighbors visited without ceremony, now entering as though the cabin belonged to them as well. Mrs. Penhaligon even brought along her spinning wheel, declaring, "If this is to be a real home, it needs the sound of women's work." One evening, old Otis Clegg sat by the fire after repairing a hinge on the barn door. He tapped his pipe thoughtfully and said, "You've built something here, Miss Whitlow." Not many could. Lorena glanced around at the children sprawled across the floor with books from the preacher, Mercy rocking the baby Ezra, mending a boot with painstaking care. Her heart swelled. "It isn't mine alone," she replied. "It's theirs. I only lit the fire." Otis nodded slowly as though confirming what he already knew. But not every visitor carried kindness. Near the end of February, a shadow fell across the doorway. Lorena looked up from kneading bread to see a man she didn't recognize. His coat was fine but travel-stained, his hat brim low. He leaned on the doorframe, eyes sweeping the room with something that made her stomach twist. "I hear there's room in this cabin for strays," he said smoothly. "Maybe a place for me." Ezra stiffened, rising from his stool. "We don't need you." The man's grin widened. Not asking the boy, asking the woman. Lorena stepped forward, flour still dusting her hands. "You found the wrong house. This one's full." The stranger's gaze lingered on Ione, then on Mercy, and Lorena felt heat rise in her chest. She gripped the edge of the table hard enough to leave imprints. I said it's full. Before the man could reply, Gideon Talmadge appeared from behind the barn, shotgun slung easy across his arm. His eyes narrowed. "Move along," he ordered. The man chuckled but backed away. "Plenty of houses on this prairie. We'll see which ones last through spring." With that he mounted his horse and disappeared into the whitening dusk. Lorena's hands trembled as she returned to the dough, but her voice stayed steady. "Children, remember this. A home isn't safe because of walls. It's safe because we guard each other." Ezra nodded fiercely. "And we'll guard you too." That night, as the snow thickened again, and the babies slept in their makeshift cradles, Lorena sat by the hearth and thought of how far they had come. They were no longer merely a household clinging to survival. They were becoming a fortress, not of stone but of love chosen each day. She wrote in the ledger before sleeping her script, careful. "Another winter storm, another test. We remain. This home is not given, it is built. And every soul here is proof that even the lost can be found." The fire cracked, scattering sparks, like stars, and Lorena whispered into the night, "We are no one's strays anymore. We are a family." And the prairie howling beyond the walls seemed to bend in reluctant agreement. Spring did not arrive with gentle warmth in Ash Hollow. It came reluctantly, as though the land had to be coaxed back from death. Snow melted into muddy rivulets that carved ruts down the slope of Coyote Bluff, leaving behind broken fence posts and fields trampled by winter winds. Yet in that ruin, life stirred. The ground smelled rich again, the creek ran fuller, and the air carried the faintest hint of green. Ezra was the first to seize it. "Pa always said this patch could grow tomatoes," he told Lorena one morning, pointing to the corner of the yard where half-buried stones outlined a forgotten plot. His eyes shone with something more than memory. It was hope daring to be born. Lorena handed him a spade. "Then we'll plant it, Ezra. Not for your father, not for me, but for you." The boy dug with furious determination, his hands blistering mud spattering across his face. Mercy and the younger boys followed, pulling weeds, breaking clods, chasing worms with shrieks of delight. Lorena knelt beside them, her skirt soaked and knees aching, and together they worked until the sun dipped low and the ground lay ready for seed. That evening, Lorena wrote in the ledger, "Today we planted more than tomatoes. Today we planted roots of our own." The cabin itself demanded tending too. The roof still leaked where snow had warped the boards, and one shutter dangled loose. Gideon arrived with a wagon full of tools, his face grim but his actions steady. He spent hours repairing, cutting new planks, hammering nails with a precision that echoed like a drumbeat of renewal. Ezra hovered close, studying every movement. "Teach me," he demanded at last. Gideon paused, eyes flicking to Lorena, then back to the boy. "You'll blister your hands worse than the spade did. Then I'll blister them." Ezra shot back. A corner of Gideon's mouth twitched almost a smile. He handed Ezra the hammer, guiding his grip. Each strike rang clumsy at first, then steadier. By sundown, Ezra's shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but pride burned in his eyes. Lorena watched from the porch, heart swelling. For all his flaws, Gideon had given them something vital. A man's presence that taught without words, a reminder that strength could be passed down instead of abandoned. Inside, the household bustled. Mercy declared herself keeper of the kitchen and began experimenting with whatever scraps they had left. One evening she boiled nettles into soup, proud until everyone gagged at the bitterness. She flushed with shame, but Lorena hugged her close. "Every cook burns her first pot. Tomorrow you'll try again." And she did seasoning carefully, laughing when the younger boys asked for seconds. Ione, too, began to glow. Her baby had grown stronger, cheeks rounder, and with each passing day her shoulders straightened. She learned to mend boots from scraps, to swaddle with skill, to sing with a voice no longer broken. "I thought I came here only to survive," she confessed to Lorena one night, eyes glistening. "But now, I think I came to live." Lorena kissed her brow. "That is what this house is for. Not just surviving, living." But peace never lingered long. One afternoon, while the children played in the mud, Ezra spotted it first. A thin column of smoke rising again from the east ridge. He stiffened, his voice low. "They're back." Lorena followed his gaze, dread pooling in her stomach. She remembered the carved wooden warning left in the yard, the boot prints, near the barn, the threats of Brackett and Millerick. The law had not yet returned with its sheriff, but shadows never forgot their promises. That evening, she gathered the children close around the hearth. Listen to me, she said firmly. The world may try to take what we've built. Men may come with papers, with threats, with fists. But no one can take the choice we've made to love each other. That choice is stronger than any law. Ezra's eyes burned. Mercy reached for her hand. The younger boys nodded, solemn as old men. Even Ione whispered, "Then we'll stand together." Lorena looked at them all, her heart fierce with love. Yes. Together. Always. The wind moaned against the shutters, carrying with it the scent of distant smoke. Yet inside the cabin, the fire blazed, children's laughter still lingered, and Lorena felt the unshakable truth rise within her. They were not merely surviving another season. They were building something that no threat, no debt, no stranger on horseback could undo. And if the ridge was watching, then let it watch a family too strong to scatter. Spring crept slowly over Coyote Bluff, but the ridge still carried shadows. The children laughed more freely now, chasing one another through patches of thawed earth, yet Lorena Whitlow never allowed her guard to soften. She had lived too long with the memory of men's threats to believe they had been silenced. Her unease proved right. Late one afternoon, hoofbeats cracked across the valley. Dust rose where the thaw had dried the ground, and two riders came into view, Brackett and Millerick. Their faces were set, their shoulders stiff, and this time they carried more than sneers, they carried authority. Brackett dismounted, first boots sinking into mud. He waved a folded document, its wax seal red as blood. "Brought the law with us," he announced. "Judge's order says this land was never settled proper. Children here got no mother by law. They're wards of the county now." The cabin door creaked behind Lorena. Ezra stepped out tall for his 10 years rifle across his chest. Mercy followed, clutching the baby with one arm, her other hand gripping the doorframe as though it were a shield. The younger boys pressed their faces to the window, watching with wide, fearful eyes. Lorena took a step forward, shawl whipping in the wind. "The law you hold is paper. What I hold is flesh and blood. These children are not wards. They are mine." Brackett smirked. "Fine words, but ink speaks louder than sentiment." He thrust the document toward her. Before Lorena could reply, Gideon Talmadge appeared from the barn, shotgun resting easy in his hands. He strode across the yard, planting himself between the cabin and the intruders. His voice rang cold. "You'll not take one step closer," Millerick sneered. "Threatening officers of the court, are you?" From the fence line came another voice, steady, sharp. "Officers." "Mrs." Penhaligon stood there, her shawl wrapped tight, a basket of kindling on her arm. "I see no badges. Only men with greed in their eyes." Behind her trudged old Otis Clegghammer, slung like a weapon, followed by 3 neighbors with tools and tired faces hardened into resolve. They had come not for spectacle, but for witness. Lorena reached into her apron, drawing forth the ledger Silas had left along with the letter she had read by lamplight, words still etched into her heart. She held them high. "Here is my proof. Silas Talmadge wrote his wish that I remain, that I raise these children, that this house stand as theirs. The law you clutch cannot erase a dying man's last covenant." The neighbors murmured their assent, voices low, but firm. Even Ezra lifted his chin and declared, "She's our mama. That's all the proof that matters." For the first time, Brackett faltered. He glanced at the circle forming around the cabin. Lorena at the center. Children clinging to her skirts, Gideon with shotgun-ready, neighbors gathering like stone walls. The weight of community pressed heavier than any paper. Millerick hissed under his breath, tugging at his companion's sleeve. "Not today. We'll return with the sheriff." "Do so," Gideon replied, his voice flat. "But when you come, you'll find a house that doesn't bend." The 2 men mounted their horses, skittish beneath them. They spat curses into the dirt, then rode hard toward the horizon, their threats trailing behind like smoke. Silence settled after their departure, broken only by the baby's cries and the wind rattling the bare branches. Lorena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to Ezra, who still clutched the rifle, his arms trembling. She pressed a hand to his cheek. "You stood for me." He swallowed, eyes glistening. "You stood for us first." Mercy laid her small hand atop Lorena's. "They'll come back," she whispered. "Yes," Lorena answered, pulling all of them close. "But so will we. Stronger every time." That night, after the children slept, the neighbors lingered. They spoke of debts repaid, of rebuilding fences together, of watching the ridge for riders. The air in the cabin was thick with smoke and fatigue, but also with a new certainty. Lorena realized she no longer carried the burden alone. The cabin was no longer a fragile shelter standing against the world. It was a cornerstone braced by many hands. As she closed the ledger and set it back on the mantel, she whispered, "Not by law, not by blood, but by choice. And choice will always win." The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing upward like a prayer carried to the heavens. By the time the last of the snow surrendered to spring, the cabin on Coyote Bluff no longer resembled the forlorn hut Lorena Whitlow had first entered. The roof stood straight with Gideon's new planks. The windows were patched with wool and flour sack curtains Mercy had stitched herself. Ezra had hammered together a rough swing that creaked from the porch beam where the younger boys jostled for their turn. Even the chickens strutted proudly in a proper coop, clucking as if the land itself had forgiven their losses. Inside, the air smelled not of ash and thin broth, but of bread stew and soap. The babies gurgled from their cradles. Mercy scolded her brothers with the voice of a matron twice her age, and Ione laughed a sound Lorena treasured, for it was proof that broken things could be mended. Ezra, taller, now carried himself with the gravity of a man in the making. Lorena often paused at the doorway, pressing her hand against the frame, as though to remind herself this was real. She had arrived empty-handed, a stranger summoned by a dying man's letter, but she had become the cornerstone of a home. Not by marriage vows, not by the law's decree, but by choice that had been tested and held fast. One warm afternoon, neighbors gathered in the yard. Otis Clegg brought nails, Mrs. Penhaligon brought pies, and others carried seed for planting. Together they worked, laughing, gossiping, mending fences, and trimming the yard. It was not a barn raising, but it felt close, a community raising a house into something more than shelter. When the work was done, Lorena set the ledger on the mantel and carefully inked the last line, Lorena Whitlow Talmadge, head of household by heart if not by law. Ezra leaned over her shoulder, reading the words with solemn pride. "That's the truth," he murmured, "and no one can take it away." As the sun lowered, Lorena sat on the porch swing with the babies in her lap, her gaze on the horizon. Gideon leaned against the porch rail, arms folded, eyes watchful as always. But tonight his expression was easier, softened by something like peace. "You've built more than a home," he said quietly. "You've built a fire that others gather to." Silas couldn't have asked for more. Lorena swallowed past the lump in her throat. "It wasn't me alone. It was all of us, choosing day by day." Gideon nodded, tipping his hat. "And that's the kind of foundation no storm can sweep away." The children tumbled into the yard, chasing fireflies that winked to life in the dusk. Their laughter rose, mingling with the creak of the swing, the steady thrum of life continuing. Later, when the stars blanketed the prairie, Lorena wrote one final note and tucked it into the ledger beside Silas's last words. "If you find this house, know that none of us were born lucky. But each of us chose to stay, chose to love, chose to build even with nothing. If you are lost, hungry, or unsure whether the world still holds people who won't let go, come in. There is soup on the fire and a bed in the corner. We've been waiting for you." She closed the book, kissed the sleeping baby in her arms, and let her eyes rest on the children sprawled across quilts stitched from scraps. This was no longer just Silas Talmadge's house. It was no longer only hers. It was theirs, woven from grief and laughter, scars and stubborn hope. A home forged not by fortune, but by the fiercest truth the West had ever known. Love chosen is stronger than blood. Years later, when the children had grown and the house had gained new rooms and sturdier walls, Lorena often sat on the porch swing and thought back to the day she had first stepped off the train at Ash Hollow Station. She had expected a husband waiting with promises of comfort, but instead she had found grief, hungry faces, and an empty chair at the head of the table. What she discovered in the years that followed was far greater than the dream she had once clung to. Love, she learned, is not always born from vows or sealed by rings. Sometimes love is a choice made in the darkest moments when walking away would be easier. Sometimes it is forged in hunger, in sickness, in the stubborn refusal to abandon one another. The Talmadge children did not need a bride to arrive with a pretty dress or a dowry. They needed someone to say, "I will not leave." And Lorena, though she had come empty-handed, gave them that gift. In return, they gave her a name she had never dared to claim, Mother. That is the lesson this story carries for us all. Family is not always born, but built. It is shaped by sacrifice, tempered by hardship, and bound by love that refuses to yield. Dear friends, if this tale touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what family means to you, or the moment you learned love is stronger than law or circumstance. And if you wish to hear more stories of courage, redemption, and love on the Wild West frontier, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who might need a reminder that hope still lives in the hardest places.